Hello, hello. I am back. I am alive. I just have been lazy when it comes to these videos. So we got back on the road and made the beautiful drive to the Pinnacles, which are naturally occurring limestone mounds of varying size and shape, which were formed approximately 25 to 30,000 years ago. You can drive through this 4.5 k's track and walk amongst these fascinating pillars. With great difficulty, we climbed a dune to get a good view before waddling back down to the car to find a good spot for sunset, where we made some dinner and watched the shadows descend around the slightly anticlimactic sunset that was clouded out. However, nonetheless, a beautiful place to have dinner. We drove out of this now eerie location to find a camp and rest after a busy first day back on the road. Starting the day at Jurien Bay, we had breakfast and walked the jetty, which now all seem small compared to the mammoth at Bustleton, and a dog parking bay, which I loved. Driving to the next location, we noticed one side of the road scorched by a recent fire and the other side lush and green. Soon after, we got to the four-wheel driving venture to Stockyard Gully Cave Tunnel. We made the short walk and scramble to the cave where we would slowly plunge into darkness, and it was not long enough or deep enough for my jacket to be necessary. So after the 300 meters, we emerged hot and ready to move on to the next exciting adventure. With a stop to clean the windscreen, which it turns out is a never-ending job on these roads, we arrived in Geraldton. I admired a supported tree before we got to an area to make dinner and watch the sunset. On the road again, we made an early start to get to Calbury, appreciating the rolling hills and gorges within the national park. We started with Nature's Window walking trail loop, starting of course with Nature's Window itself, sitting prettily, however adorned with flies. We moved on. Kitted with a fly net and a can-do attitude, we walked along the rim of the gorge, admiring the hempcrete-looking gorge wall as we descended into the gorge. Tackling more flies now as we were without the aid of the wind, we had more rock scrambles as we made our way round the trail and some sandier paths to contend with before we made it to the end and moved on to the skywalks. Both of these give beautiful views of the gorge, as long as you don't mind the heights. After this, we checked out Calbury town, which was very picturesque, but as Oscar didn't have any fishing gear, we moved on, once again, to camp. We set up, and once I was safely within the fly netting, I kindly offered Oscar my fly net, and he explored the camp and found some goats. The goats were spotted once again the next morning before we set off for Shark Bay. The sea views along the way added to the excitement before we stopped in at Denham, then made our way to Francois Peron National Park, with its sandy roads giving Oscar a chance to show off his four-wheel driving skills, or so he likes to think. After the contents of the car was somewhat reorganised, we got to our beach camp on Harold Bight. We set up camp, fighting off the flies. After Kilbarry, we thought it was best to invest in a second fly net for Oscar, while I tried more evasive action to lose the flies, which unfortunately was not successful, so we decided to go for a dip in the beautiful water. The flies did stick around for a bit, but we managed to lose them and enjoy the shallow waters, which made us feel like we were walking on water. We found funky shells, a few little crabs, hermit crabs, and sea snails, and of course, a car engine. The shallow, still waters became even more magical around sunset, reflecting the beautiful sky, and to make it even better, we had the whole beach to ourselves. As darkness began, the flies left, but the moths and other nocturnal creatures came out. So we dined and danced under the protection of more nets until we noticed some noises coming from the water. So we investigated and found lots of little fish. Admired the night sky and the way the sea reflected this beautifully. The sunrise the next morning was just as beautiful as the sunset of the night before. We went for a morning walk along the beach and found a sea slug doing the same. Today we ventured the national park, with more four-wheel driving for Oscar, and I was getting all the good content, which Oscar enjoys more than he shows, I promise. First stop was Skipjack Point, where there are 3 viewing platforms from which you can spot reef sharks, stingrays, and get fleeting glimpses of turtles. We spent quite some time here, just watching all the marine life before going to Cape Peron, which showcases the magnificent blue waters, white sands, and red dirt. We stopped to take it all in before scrambling up the hill, some of us more gracefully than others, and then hopped back in the car to get to Gregory's, which we'd heard is good snorkeling at high tide, so we got in and enjoyed all the fish and coral, one of which was particularly vibrant. I had unfortunately been caught on some oyster stacks, so we made our way back to camp for our final night in the national park. We woke up hoping for another magical sunrise. However, unlike the glow of the previous day, we were clouded out, so I rested my injuries before we got back on the road with much enthusiasm. We stopped at Big Lagoon for some spectacular views of, you guessed it, the Big Lagoon. From here, Oscar caught sight of emus swimming and wanted to investigate. Unfortunately, they were nowhere to be seen by the time we got there, so we headed back to the car to continue northwards. We were going to set up in a free camp near Geraldton, however, high tides had made the road boggy, and not wanting to be bogged in mud again so close to sunset, we opted for heading to Geraldton, where we stayed in a caravan park which hosted Pizza Fridays, where you can bring your own pizza and they cook it in their pizza oven, which was a perfect way to end the day. The next day we noticed a tomato sauce explosion in our fridge, so cleaned the fridge, then cleaned Pingu, fueled up and hit the tarmac. In the haste of getting back on the road, I'd forgotten the ice cream I bought at the servo, but let's face it, I still enjoyed it. Along the journey, we noticed a wedge-tailed eagle on the side of the road, so we pulled over to get a better look at the trouser-wearing raptor, although it didn't seem to love the attention, so we moved on to Coral Bay, where we parked up next to the beach and made dinner. We took our meal up a dune to enjoy the sunset with countless other people as the sun dipped beyond the horizon and the sky changed colours. We stayed here for about an hour watching the different stages of the sunset before we thought it best to make moves back to camp. The next morning was surprisingly foggy but cleared up quickly as we got on with our day, starting with snorkeling at Coral Bay. We floated over various types of coral and fish as we made our way deeper, trying to find Ayers Rock, which is a big coral head called a bommy. Despite our best efforts, we didn't find Ayers Rock itself, but we found a beautiful bommy with an array of fish all around. Oscar took a closer look at some of the fish, and we admired them for a little while before making our way back out of the water for lunch. We took in the views and made some friends. We stopped by the snorkeling hire and were told about Five Fingers, which is another snorkeling spot nearby through a four-wheel drive track, and this was the best snorkeling we had done so far. Good visibility, the coral was more colourful, and the marine life more plentiful. We saw a reef shark, which is clearer towards the end of this clip, a blue-ringed stingray steaming along, and a hawksbill turtle cruising by, and another UAM that came a bit too close for comfort. Us got some more four-wheel driving in before we headed back to Coral Bay Beach to make dinner and admire yet another beautiful sunset. I know what you're thinking, it is a hard life. The next day we prepared for more off-roading by reducing the tyre pressures and set off for Ningaloo Reef, which is a notoriously corrugated road, not for the faint-hearted. We took the road slow and were able to appreciate the near coastal drive, also hoping to see a thorny devil along the way. No luck in that regard, however, many a termite mound was seen, and much dust was kicked up. Soon enough we saw the sign for camp and set up, and no sooner than that were we back in the water alongside pretty fish and found another turtle floating by, and another one that was in a bit more of a hurry. As the end of the day approached, we made dinner and made friends with some hawk moths before the heavens opened and we had to run around holding our tent down and packing away items that could not get wet. The next morning came peacefully and the sun was a welcome guest to help dry everything before we moved to campsite and continued tidying up the mess of the night before. After which we had a well-deserved snorkeling session full of pretty fish, a pretty big pufferfish, a turtle, an interesting shoal of fish, and the biggest green sea turtle either of us had ever seen. It's safe to say that the Ningaloo Reef has made a big snorkeling fan of me, and this camp in particular is interesting as it is one of the points along the Ningaloo Reef where the outer reef is closest to shore, making the marine life that bit more accessible. After a mildly wet night, we closed up camp and headed to the dump point, which I'm sure was a highlight of Oscar's trip so far, and then we got back to the noisy roads that took us to Yardie Creek, which we'd anticipated would be a tough water crossing. However, due to the very dry summer, it had dried up, so we breezed across it to the silence of the bitumen road, until our snorkeling stop at South Mandu and Oyster Stacks, where we saw a white moray eel and a colourful juvenile emperor angelfish. Pingu hit the big 300000, and we arrived at Exmouth, where we got to watch an interesting talk on manta rays before embarking on the Exmouth stint of our trip.